The hum of Nexus Prime's atmospheric processors created a constant background noise that Jake Morrison had learned to filter out over the years, but today it seemed louder, more insistent, like the station itself was holding its breath. He stood in docking bay 12, staring at the twisted wreckage of what had been the Calorian diplomatic vessel Stellar Grace, and tried to calculate how many years of cargo runs it would take to pay for the damage his ship had caused. Could have been worse, Elena Vasquez said from beside him, her engineers cataloging the destruction with professional detachment. Could have hit their engines instead of just the ceremonial wing. The ceremonial wing that cost more than our entire ship, Jake replied, watching Calorian repair crews swarm over the damaged vessel like metallic insects. And apparently contain some kind of ancestral shrine that can't be replaced. Marcus Chen, his pilot, whistled low as he joined them. The docking computer said we had clearance. How were we supposed to know their ship was executing some kind of traditional approach pattern that required twice the normal space? Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of what promised to be a spectacular headache. 3 days ago, this had been a routine supply run to the outer colonies. Now he was facing bankruptcy and possible imprisonment for what the Calorians were calling cultural vandalism with intent to humiliate. Captain Morrison. The voice carried the kind of authority that made people stop talking and pay attention. Jake turned to see Elder Vextar approaching, his ceremonial robes flowing around him like liquid starlight. The Calorian's elongated ears were adorned with complex jewelry that chimed softly with each step, marking his status in a society where ear ornamentation was both art and social hierarchy. Elder Vextar, Jake replied, offering the formal bow that Elena had coached him on. I want to apologize again for the accident. My crew and I. Your apologies cannot restore what was destroyed, Vextar interrupted, but his tone carried more weariness than anger. The shrine contained artifacts dating back to the first colony. Their loss is significant. Jake felt his stomach sink further. What can I do to make this right? Vextar studied him with eyes that seemed older than the stars themselves. You are familiar with our customs regarding debt and honor? Somewhat. Jake had learned enough about Calorian culture to know that their concepts of justice were complex and often involved personal obligation rather than simple monetary payment. There is an ancient tradition called the bond of understanding. It allows for alternative forms of compensation when monetary payment is impossible. Vextar paused, and Jake noticed that several other Calorians had gathered nearby, their ornate ear jewelry creating a soft symphony of metallic whispers. You would take one of my daughters aboard your vessel as a cultural liaison. She would serve for one full cycle, learning your ways while teaching you ours. At the end of this period, the debt would be considered satisfied. Jake exchanged glances with Elena and Marcus. A year-long commitment to carrying a Calorian passenger was hardly ideal for a cargo operation that depended on flexibility and quick turnarounds, but it was better than bankruptcy. I accept, he said formally. Vextar's expression shifted subtly, and Jake realized the elder had expected more negotiation. Very well. My daughters await your selection. The ceremony that followed felt like something from an ancient court rather than a space station trading floor. 5 Calorian women were presented in order of age, each more stunning than the last according to standards that Jake was only beginning to understand. Their ears were works of art, decorated with precious metals and gems that caught the station's artificial lighting and threw it back in patterns that seemed to tell stories. The eldest, Zara, carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being admired. Her ear ornaments were elaborate constructions of silver and blue crystal that marked her as a trained diplomat. She inclined her head gracefully when introduced, and Jake could see intelligence in her eyes that would probably make her an excellent cultural liaison. The second daughter, Leora, was introduced as a scholar of interspecies trade law. Her ear decorations were more subdued but equally complex, and she studied Jake with the kind of analytical gaze that suggested she was already calculating the legal implications of their arrangement. The third and fourth daughters were presented with similar ceremony, each beautiful, accomplished, and clearly comfortable with being evaluated like prize livestock. Jake felt increasingly uncomfortable with the entire process, but he understood enough about Calorian customs to know that refusing to participate would be a greater insult than the original accident. Then came the fifth daughter. Kira stood at the end of the line, and Jake's first thought was that someone had made a mistake. She was younger than the others, her posture humble rather than proud, and her ears were completely unadorned. Where her sister's hands were soft and pale from lives spent in scholarly pursuits, Kira's were marked with scars that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "My youngest," Vextar said, and Jake caught something in his tone that might have been disappointment or resignation. "Kira has different interests than her sisters." The other daughters exchanged glances that carried meanings Jake couldn't read, but he caught the edge of disdain in their expressions. Whatever Kira's story was, it clearly marked her as the family disappointment. Jake studied the five women, aware that his choice would have consequences far beyond the simple mechanics of debt payment. Custom dictated that he should choose based on beauty and status, probably Zara or one of her accomplished sisters. It would be the diplomatic choice, the safe choice. But something about Kira's scarred hands and unadorned ears made him think of his own journey from colony world mechanic to independent cargo captain, and how many people had underestimated him along the way. "I choose Kira," he said clearly. The silence that followed was profound enough that Jake could hear individual conversations from clear across the docking bay. Vextar's expression went through several rapid changes before settling into something that might have been surprise or might have been calculation. "You choose Kira," he repeated, as if he might have misheard. "She looks like she knows how to work," Jake replied, meeting the elder's gaze steadily. "And in my experience, that's worth more than pretty jewelry." Kira's ears twitched slightly, the first real movement Jake had seen from her since the ceremony began. Her sisters looked relieved and slightly insulted in equal measure, while the gathering crowd of Calorians began murmuring in their liquid language that sounded like water flowing over crystal. "Very well," Vextar said finally. "Kira will serve as your cultural liaison for one full cycle. May this arrangement bring understanding between our peoples." As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself standing beside Kira, suddenly aware that he just committed to spending a year with someone he knew nothing about except that her own family seemed to consider her worthless. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent that made his name sound like music. "Thank you for choosing me." "Jake," he corrected automatically. "And you don't need to thank me. We're going to be working together." Her ears tilted forward slightly, and Jake realized that Calorian ear movements were probably as expressive as human facial expressions. "Working together? You didn't think I was going to keep you as some kind of decorative passenger, did you?" Jake asked, genuinely surprised. "If you're going to be on my ship for a year, you're going to earn your keep." For the first time since he'd met her, Kira smiled. It transformed her entire face, and Jake realized that the Calorian definition of beauty might be missing something important. "I think," she said, her ears rotating in what he suspected might be amusement, "this arrangement may be more interesting than anyone expected." As they walked toward the frontier's edge, Jake caught Elena grinning at him with the kind of expression that suggested she'd figured out something he hadn't realized himself. "Interesting choice, Captain," she said quietly. "Practical choice," Jake corrected, but even as he said it, he wondered if there might be more truth in Elena's observation than he was ready to admit. The frontier's edge had seen better decades, but Jake maintained her with the kind of meticulous care that kept older ships running when newer ones failed. As he led Kira through the cargo bay toward the crew quarters, he found himself seeing the ship through alien eyes and wondering what she made of the practical, unadorned functionality that he preferred. "Your vessel is smaller than I expected," Kira said, running one scarred hand along a support beam with the kind of touch that suggested familiarity with mechanical systems. "Smaller means more maneuverable," Jake replied, then paused as he realized something. "You've been on ships before." "I volunteer in the engineering sections of Nexus Prime," Kira said, her ears drooping slightly as if she expected criticism. "It's not considered appropriate work for someone of my family's status, but the maintenance supervisors don't care about bloodlines when systems need repair." Elena emerged from behind a stack of cargo containers, wiping grease from her hands and grinning. A Calorian who knows engineering. Captain, I think I'm going to like your choice. Elena Vasquez, my chief engineer, Jake introduced. Elena, this is Kira. The one who was supposed to be decorative cargo, Elena said with the kind of blunt humor that had gotten her thrown out of 3 different merchant academies. Except she's got calluses that say otherwise. Kira's ears perked forward with what Jake was learning to recognize as interest. You maintain this entire ship yourself? With help from Marcus and the captain when things get complicated, Elena replied. Though if you know your way around a plasma conduit, I wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands. I know plasma conduits, Kira said, and there was something in her voice that suggested depths Jake hadn't expected. Though I should warn you that Calorian engineering principles may differ from human approaches. Different how? Jake asked, suddenly curious about what other assumptions he'd been making. We tend to build redundant systems within redundant systems, Kira explained, moving toward one of the ship's access panels with the confidence of someone who understood mechanical layouts. Our ears are sensitive enough to detect minute vibrations in ship systems, so we design for harmonic efficiency rather than pure power output. She opened the panel and studied the contents with the kind of focus Jake recognized from watching Elena diagnose problems. After a moment, her ears began moving independently, rotating and tilting as if she were listening to something the humans couldn't hear. Your power coupling efficiency could be improved by about 12%, she said without looking up from the panel. The harmonic resonance is creating microvibrations that are probably causing premature wear on your plasma regulators. Elena moved to look over Kira's shoulder, her expression shifting from casual interest to professional respect. Show me. For the next 20 minutes, Jake found himself watching Kira and Elena collaborate on improvements to systems he'd thought were running perfectly well. Kira's approach was different from anything he'd seen. She seemed to listen to the ship's mechanical rhythms with her ears, then translate what she heard into practical adjustments that made everything run smoother. Where did you learn to do that? Elena asked finally, her tone carrying the kind of admiration she usually reserved for particularly elegant pieces of engineering. Kira's ears drooped again, and Jake realized this was her response to questions about her background. The engineering supervisors on Nexus Prime found my hearing useful for diagnosing system problems. I've been working with them for several years. Several years of volunteer work, Jake said, beginning to understand why Vextar had seemed surprised by his choice. Work that your family considers inappropriate. Work that my family considers degrading, Kira corrected quietly. Calorians of high status are expected to pursue scholarly or diplomatic careers. Manual labor is for lower castes. Marcus appeared in the cargo bay doorway, probably drawn by the sound of voices and Elena's occasional exclamations of professional approval. Are we taking on crew, or is this a passenger with unusual hobbies? Kira, Marcus Chen, our pilot, Jake introduced. Marcus, Kira just improved our power efficiency by 12% in 20 minutes. Marcus raised an eyebrow. 12%. Elena, that's better than your last 3 major overhauls combined. Don't remind me, Elena muttered, but she was grinning. Kira, how would you feel about taking a look at our navigation computer? It's been making some interesting noises lately. What kind of noises? Kira asked, her ears immediately perking forward with interest. Kind of a whining sound during hyperspace calculations, followed by what I can only describe as mechanical sighing. Kira's ears began rotating independently again, and Jake realized she was already listening to the ship's background sounds with an attention that went far beyond casual interest. The whining suggests bearing wear in the primary calculation matrix, she said thoughtfully. The sighing probably means your cooling system is working harder than it should to compensate for inefficient heat dissipation. Marcus looked at Jake with an expression that suggested he was rapidly revising his opinion of their passenger arrangement. Captain, I think we may have accidentally acquired the most useful cultural liaison in the history of interspecies relations. Accidentally? Elena asked with a grin that suggested she thought Jake's choice had been more deliberate than he was admitting. Before Jake could formulate a response, the ship's food synthesizer chose that moment to emit a sound like a dying whale, followed by a series of mechanical hiccups that suggested it was trying to process something far outside its normal parameters. "What was that?" Kira asked, her ears flattening against her head in what appeared to be alarm. "Our food synthesizer attempting to understand calorian dietary requirements," Marcus explained. "It's been making increasingly creative noises ever since Jake uploaded your nutritional profiles." "Creative how?" Jake asked, suddenly worried about what they were going to feed their passenger for the next year. The synthesizer answered by producing a sound like a musical instrument being tortured, followed by a cheerful beep that somehow managed to sound sarcastic. "I think it's protesting," Elena said, studying the synthesizer's display panel. "According to this readout, calorian nutritional requirements include trace minerals that our system has never heard of. And the synthesizer is expressing its philosophical objections through interpretive mechanical noises," Marcus added. "Very artistic, actually." Kira moved toward the synthesizer with the same focused attention she'd brought to the power couplings. "May I?" "Please," Jake said. "Before it decides to synthesize something that tries to synthesize us back." Kira opened the synthesizer's maintenance panel and immediately began listening with that peculiar ear-rotating focus that Jake was beginning to find fascinating. After a moment, she reached into the panel and began making adjustments with movements that were both precise and oddly gentle. "The issue isn't the dietary requirements," she said without looking up from her work. "It's the way the system is trying to process them. Human food synthesizers work on molecular assembly principles, but they're designed for relatively simple organic compounds. Calorian dietary needs include some complex mineral structures that your system is interpreting as impossible requests. So what's the solution?" Elena asked. "Teach it to think like a calorian synthesizer," Kira replied, her hands moving through the synthesizer's circuits with practiced ease. "Instead of trying to build complex molecules from scratch, we configure it to modify simpler compounds into the structures we need." The synthesizer's tortured mechanical sounds gradually shifted into something that almost resembled a purr. After a few minutes, it produced a cheerful chime that sounded genuinely pleased with itself. "Try requesting a basic calorian nutrition supplement," Kira suggested, closing the maintenance panel. Jake input the request, and the synthesizer responded with what sounded like mechanical humming, followed by the appearance of a pale blue substance that looked vaguely appetizing. "It's working," Marcus said, sounding impressed. "And it seems happy about it." "Machines work better when they understand what you're asking them to do," Kira said, her ears tilting in what Jake was beginning to recognize as satisfaction. The same principle applies to people. As Jake watched Kira examine other ship systems with the kind of professional competence that his crew was clearly beginning to appreciate, he realized that choosing her might have been the smartest decision he'd made in years, even if he'd made it for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. "Kira," he said as she finished adjusting something in the navigation console that made Marcus nod approvingly, "I have a question." "Yes." "Those scars on your hands. How did you get them?" Her ears immediately flattened against her head, and Jake saw something in her expression that looked like old pain. "An accident. Several years ago." "What kind of accident?" Kira was quiet for a long moment, her scarred hands resting on the navigation console as if drawing comfort from its mechanical solidity. "The kind where you have to choose between what's safe and what's right," she said finally. "And you choose right, even when it costs you everything." Jake studied her expression and realized that there was a story behind those scars that probably explained why her family considered her a disappointment, and why he'd been drawn to choose her despite all logical considerations. "Well," he said finally, "I think you made the right choice. Whatever it was." Kira's ears perked forward slightly, and when she looked at him, Jake caught a glimpse of something that might have been gratitude, or hope, or maybe just the relief of being understood. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For seeing value where others see only damage." As Jake prepared to give the order to undock from Nexus Prime, he realized that the next year was going to be far more interesting than anyone had expected, and that sometimes the most important choices were the ones that made sense only in retrospect. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Jake had grown accustomed to the subtle sounds of Kira moving through the ship during the night cycles, her ears apparently detecting mechanical irregularities that required adjustment. What he hadn't expected was to be awakened by the ship's proximity alarms screaming warnings about an unidentified vessel in their path. Captain to the bridge, Marcus's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant something significant was happening. "We've got a situation." Jake made his way to the bridge to find Marcus, Elena, and Kira clustered around the main display, which showed the sensor profile of what appeared to be a massive derelict ship drifting in the darkness between star systems. "Generation ship," Elena announced without looking up from her instruments. "Pre-hyperspace design, probably been out here for centuries." "Any signs of life?" Jake asked, settling into his command chair and trying to process what he was seeing. The ship was enormous, easily 10 times the size of the Frontier's Edge, with the kind of modular construction that suggested it had been built to carry an entire civilization. "That's the interesting question," Kira said, her ears rotating with the focused attention she brought to complex problems. "The ship appears derelict according to standard sensor sweeps, but there are some unusual energy signatures that don't match typical decay patterns." Jake studied the display, noting the way the derelict ship seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Unusual how?" "The power grid is completely dark, but there are localized energy pockets that suggest some systems are still running on backup power," Marcus explained. "Could be automated systems, could be something else." "Something else like what?" Elena asked. Kira moved closer to the sensor console, her scarred hands dancing over the controls with the kind of precision Jake had learned to associate with her technical insights. "The energy signatures are too regular for random system failures, but too intermittent for full automation. If I had to guess, I'd say someone is managing power distribution manually." "Survivors?" Jake felt his pulse quicken. A generation ship that had been drifting for centuries with living passengers was either a rescue opportunity or a nightmare scenario, depending on what kind of shape those passengers were in. "Possibly," Kira said, her ears tilting in what he'd learned meant uncertainty. "Though if there are survivors, they're either in some kind of stasis or they've been managing resources very carefully for a very long time." Elena consulted her instruments with the kind of professional focus that meant she was calculating salvage possibilities. According to interstellar law, a derelict vessel can be claimed for salvage after 72 hours of no response to standard hailing frequencies. "And if there are survivors?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then it's not derelict, and salvage law doesn't apply," Marcus replied. "It becomes a rescue situation." Jake studied the massive ship on his display and tried to calculate the implications. Salvaging a generation ship could set them up financially for life, but rescuing survivors was the right thing to do, even if it meant complications with multiple planetary governments and refugee organizations. "Standard hailing frequencies," he decided. "Let's see if anyone's home." The next hour passed with increasingly complex attempts to contact the derelict ship. Standard human frequencies produced no response, but when Kira suggested trying broader spectrum approaches, they began picking up faint signals that might have been automated responses or might have been something else entirely. "There," Kira said suddenly, her ears perking forward with excitement. "That harmonic pattern in the background noise. It's not random." "Meaning what?" Elena asked. "Meaning someone is trying to communicate, but they're using a frequency modulation system I've never seen before," Kira explained, her hands working over the communications console with growing confidence. "If I can adjust our receivers to match their pattern." The bridge filled with static that gradually resolved into something that might have been music, or might have been voices, or might have been something entirely alien trying to approximate human communication patterns. "Is that a language?" Marcus asked, leaning closer to the speakers as if proximity might improve comprehension. "I think so," Kira said, her ears rotating independently as she listened. "But it's not like any linguistic structure I've studied. The tonal variations suggest multiple speakers, possibly a council or committee structure." Jake made a decision that he knew would complicate their lives but felt inevitable. Prepare a boarding party. If there are people on that ship, we need to find out what their situation is. Captain, Elena said carefully, boarding an unknown derelict is dangerous under the best circumstances. If there are survivors, we don't know what kind of shape they're in, what diseases they might carry, or whether they'll be friendly to visitors. All good points, Jake agreed. Which is why we go unprepared for anything. An hour later, Jake found himself suited up for EVA and following Kira through the makeshift airlock they'd rigged between the ships. The derelict's hull showed signs of age and impact damage, but the basic structure seemed sound enough to support exploration. According to my readings, there's atmosphere in some sections, Kira reported, her voice crackling through the comm system. Thin, but breathable for most species. How are you getting more detailed readings than our ship sensors? Jake asked. My ears, Kira replied, pressing her helmet against the hull and listening intently. I can hear air circulation systems running in the distance, and what sounds like machinery designed for life support. They made their way through corridors that spoke of a civilization Jake didn't recognize, walls covered with intricate patterns that might have been decorative or might have been lighting systems that responded to their presence with soft glows that seemed almost organic. Jake, Kira said suddenly, stopping beside what appeared to be a viewing port. Look at this. Jake moved to look through the transparent panel and felt his breath catch. The chamber beyond contained hundreds of cylindrical containers arranged in precise rows, each one glowing softly with its own internal light. Stasis pods, he breathed. But not deactivated, Kira added, her ears pressed against the viewing port as she listened. I can hear circulation systems, neural monitors, life support regulation. These people aren't dead, Jake. They're sleeping. Before Jake could respond, the corridor filled with soft light, and a voice spoke in the musical language they'd heard over the communications system. But this time, it was accompanied by holographic symbols that appeared in the air around them, shifting and changing as if trying to find a form of communication they might understand. I think, Kira said slowly, we just met our first aliens. The symbols coalesced into mathematical patterns, then star charts, then finally into images that showed the derelict ship's journey through space, a centuries-long voyage from a dying star system, carrying thousands of refugees in stasis while automated systems managed their care. They're refugees, Jake realized. And their automated systems are failing. The holographic display shifted to show technical schematics that made Kira's ears perk forward with recognition. These are the failing systems, she said, studying the images. Power distribution, atmospheric processing, stasis maintenance. They're running out of time. Jake looked at the chamber full of sleeping refugees and made another decision that would complicate their lives immeasurably. Then we'd better figure out how to help them. As they began working with the ship's artificial intelligence to understand the scope of the refugees' situation, Jake realized that what had started as a simple salvage opportunity had become something far more significant, and that Kira's technical skills and genuine compassion were about to become crucial to the survival of an entire civilization. Jake, Kira said as they prepared to return to their ship with the data they'd gathered, thank you. For what? For choosing to help rather than simply following salvage law, she replied, her ears tilting forward with what he'd learned was deep sincerity. Not everyone would make that choice. Not everyone has a cultural liaison who can hear failing stasis systems through a ship's hull, Jake replied. I think we make a good team. As they made their way back to the frontier's edge to plan the rescue operation, Jake realized that his choice of Kira was proving to have consequences he'd never anticipated, and that sometimes the most valuable partnerships were the ones that made you better than you thought you could be. The message from Nexus Prime arrived while Jake and his crew were deep in preparations for the refugee rescue operation, and its content made Jake's blood run cold. Elder Vextar was en route with a Calorian diplomatic escort, demanding the immediate return of his daughter and threatening severe consequences for what he termed abuse of cultural exchange protocols. How severe are we talking? Elena asked, reading over Jake's shoulder as he reviewed the official complaint that had been filed against him. Severe enough that they're sending 3 ships instead of 1, Marcus replied from the pilot station, where he was monitoring approaching vessels, including what looks like a military escort. Jake studied the message, trying to understand how a rescue operation had become an interstellar incident. According to Vexstar's complaint, involving Kira in dangerous salvage activities violated both the spirit and letter of their agreement, and her participation in the derelict ship exploration constituted criminal endangerment of a Calorian citizen. "Where's Kira?" he asked. "Still aboard the refugee ship," Elena replied. "She's been working with their AI to understand the stasis system failures. Says she's close to figuring out how to stabilize the failing pods." Jake activated the comm system. "Kira, we need you back on the frontier's edge. Your father is coming, and he's not happy." The response came back immediately, carrying the kind of focused intensity that Kira brought to urgent technical problems. "I can't leave now, Jake. 3 more stasis pods failed in the last hour. If I don't stabilize the power distribution system soon, we're going to start losing people. Kira, your father has filed criminal charges against me for endangering you. If you're not here when he arrives, then explain to him that I'm saving lives," Kira interrupted, her voice carrying a determination Jake had never heard before. "Tell him that his daughter is doing exactly what she was trained to do, even if he never bothered to notice." Before Jake could respond, the comm channel filled with an unfamiliar voice speaking in the musical language of the refugees. When it finished, Kira's voice returned, but now it carried something that sounded like wonder. "Jake, you need to hear this. The refugees want to speak with you directly. Can they communicate in standard? Their AI has been learning from our interactions. It wants to make a formal statement." Jake activated the recording system as a new voice came through the comm, artificial but carrying emotions that seemed entirely genuine. "Captain Morrison," the voice said in accented but clear standard, "I am the voice of the drift, speaking for those who sleep and dream of home. We have listened to your daughter who is not daughter work through our failing systems with hands that bear the scars of previous service. We have heard her speak of circuits and power flows with the knowledge of one who has chosen compassion over comfort. We name her friend of the silent, and we ask that you know the measure of her worth." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. "AI, can you explain Kira's scars? How she received them? The daughter who is not daughter has shared the memory pictures of her wounded hands. She entered fire to bring small ones to safety when others valued protocol above life. Her people called this wrong action, but we name it true action. She bears the marks of choosing right over safe." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances that carried implications Jake didn't want to consider. Through the comm, they could hear Kira working in the background, the sound of tools and technical adjustments punctuated by her voice as she coached failing systems back to stability. "How many small ones did she save?" Jake asked quietly. 47 children pulled from burning station levels while safety protocols demanded evacuation. 47 lives preserved by one who chose pain over protocol. This is the measure we use for friend not friend. Jake closed his eyes and tried to process what he was learning. Kira's scars weren't the result of mechanical accidents or clumsiness, they were the marks of someone who had deliberately chosen to endure pain to save others, and her society had punished her for it. "Captain," Marcus said quietly, "Vexstar's ships are requesting docking clearance. ETA 15 minutes. Jake opened a comm channel to the refugee ship. "Kira, I need you to come back now. Whatever you're doing." "I can't leave, Jake. Not yet." Her voice carried the kind of exhaustion that came from working beyond normal limits. "The primary stasis control matrix is cascading. If I stop now, we'll lose at least 50 pods before I can restart the process." Through the comm, Jake could hear the increasing urgency of the refugee AI's alerts, the sound of failing systems that Kira was somehow holding together through sheer determination and technical skill. "How long do you need?" he asked. 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if the backup power grid decides to be difficult. You have 10 minutes before your father arrives. Then I guess we'll find out how much trouble I can cause in 10 minutes, Kira replied, and Jake caught something in her voice that reminded him of Elena's stubborn refusal to give up on impossible technical challenges. The next 8 minutes passed with agonizing slowness as Jake listened to Kira work through increasingly desperate system failures, her voice never losing its calm focus even as the refugee AI's alerts became more urgent. In the background, he could hear the subtle sounds that indicated she was crawling through damaged conduits and working with her scarred hands in places that would be impossible for anyone else to reach. "Jake," she said finally, her voice carrying exhaustion and triumph in equal measure, "stasis system stabilized. All pods are green, and the backup matrix is online. The drift are safe." And just in time, Marcus announced. "Vexstar's ships are docking now." Jake made his way to the docking bay with Elena and Marcus, trying to prepare for a conversation that could determine whether Kira spent the next year exploring the galaxy or the next decade in a Calorian re-education facility for dishonoring her family. Elder Vexstar emerged from his diplomatic transport with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was working very hard not to start an interstellar incident. His ear ornaments chimed with agitated patterns, and his ceremonial robes seemed to crackle with barely suppressed energy. "Captain Morrison," he said without preamble, "where is my daughter?" "Completing a rescue operation that has saved thousands of lives," Jake replied, meeting the elder's gaze steadily. "She should be returning shortly. You involved her in dangerous salvage activities without my permission. You exposed her to unknown aliens and compromised her safety for profit." Jake felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, a new voice filled the docking bay, the refugee AI, speaking through the station's communication system. "Elder of the decorated ears," the AI said, its artificial voice somehow carrying profound respect, "we speak for the drift, the wandering people, the dreamers between stars. We ask permission to speak truth about your daughter who chooses right." Vexstar's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What are you?" "We are refugees from the dying star Kepler 442, sleeping for 3 centuries while our ship sought new homeworlds. We are failing, dying, forgotten by time until your daughter who bears honor scars brought us back from the edge of silence." The AI's voice filled the docking bay with images, holographic displays showing the refugee ship's journey, the failing stasis systems, and Kira working through damaged conduits with her scarred hands to restore power to dying life support systems. "We have seen her hands, marked by choosing others over self when fire threatened the small ones. We have seen her skills, learned through service others call shameful. We have seen her heart, which values life above status. We name her friend of the silent, and we ask, what people call such choosing shameful?" Vexstar stood silent, his ornate ear jewelry still chiming with agitation as he processed what he was hearing. Around the docking bay, his diplomatic escort had gone equally quiet, their expressions shifting from official disapproval to something more complex. 300 years of travel, seeking safe harbor for our people, the AI continued. 3 centuries of automated systems slowly failing while we dreamed of home. Today, your daughter's scarred hands and listening ears saved 8,000 souls from final silence. We ask again, what people call this shameful? The docking bay doors opened, and Kira emerged, her environmental suit marked with the evidence of hard work in difficult conditions. Her face was streaked with exhaustion, but her ears were held high with the satisfaction of work completed successfully. "Father," she said quietly, offering the formal bow that protocol demanded. "I apologize for not being here to greet you." Vexstar studied his daughter's appearance. The proud bearing despite her exhaustion, the evidence of technical work that would normally bring social shame, the confidence that came from knowing she had used her abilities to save lives. "Kira," he said finally, "explain to me how you came to be crawling through alien machinery instead of serving as a cultural observer." "Because cultural observation isn't service," Kira replied, her voice carrying a strength Jake had never heard before. "It's performance. And when people needed help, performance seemed less important than action. You endangered yourself for strangers. I used skills you taught me to be ashamed of to save lives you taught me to value, Kira corrected. If that's endangerment, then I choose endangerment. Vexstar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his daughter and the holographic displays that still showed the successful rescue operation. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been pride or might have been resignation. Captain Morrison, he said, my daughter appears to have found her calling. The question is whether this calling serves the interests of our people. Jake looked at Kira, who was watching her father with the kind of hopeful attention that suggested his answer would determine her future. Elder Vexstar, Jake said carefully, your daughter has just opened diplomatic relations with a new species that possesses advanced environmental restoration technology. The Drift are grateful enough to share their knowledge, and skilled enough to help terraform damaged worlds. I'd say her calling serves everyone's interests. Including yours, Captain. Jake met the Elder's knowing gaze and realized that Vexstar understood more about the situation than he'd initially revealed. Including mine. But not the way you're thinking. Explain. I chose Kira because I saw someone who'd been undervalued by people who should have known better. Working with her has taught me that sometimes the most important partnerships aren't based on what people expect from each other, but on what they're willing to give. Vexstar's ear ornaments chimed softly as he considered Jake's words. And what are you willing to give, Captain Morrison? Whatever it takes to help Kira use her abilities the way they were meant to be used, Jake replied. Even if that means spending the next year explaining to skeptics why choosing the supposedly worthless daughter was the smartest decision I ever made. Kira's ears perked forward with surprise and something that looked like gratitude. Vexstar noticed the movement, and for the first time since arriving, his expression softened into something approaching approval. Very well, he said finally. Continue your cultural exchange. But Kira will serve not as a bound cultural liaison, but as an official diplomatic representative of our people. Her work with the Drift has earned that recognition. As the ceremony concluded and Vexstar prepared to return to Calorian space, Jake found himself standing beside Kira in the docking bay, watching her father's ships depart. Thank you, she said quietly. For what this time? For seeing what I could become instead of just what I was, Kira replied, her ears tilting forward with the contentment Jake had learned to associate with her deepest satisfaction. And for choosing partnership over possession. Jake looked at the refugee ship where the Drift were beginning to emerge from stasis, ready to start new lives on new worlds with the help of technology and diplomacy that Kira had made possible. I think, he said, we're just getting started. As the Frontier's Edge prepared for its next mission, now expanded to include refugee resettlement and interspecies diplomacy. Jake realized that his choice of Kira had transformed not just his crew, but his understanding of what it meant to recognize value in unexpected places. And sometimes, he thought, the most important discoveries were the ones that taught you to see beauty in scars and strength in the places where others saw only damage.